Welcome everybody to another in our series of our Project E3 webinars. Today we're pleased to have returning to us Sean Smith and Marianne Hubner, who will talk about evolving a trauma-informed service environment. This is the second part in our series on evolving a trauma-informed service environment. Today's presentation will talk about role-specific approaches to support healing trauma. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. There will be a live question and answer session with Sean and Marianne after the presentation. So please put your questions in the Q&A box and we will get to those after the presentation. That in itself should be as good as the presentation itself. If you're interested in CRC credits, there'll be more information at the end of the session. However, periodically we will be putting a link in the chat box that will give you a place that you can go to if perchance you have to leave before the end of the session. We are scheduled to go for an hour and a half, 90 minutes presentation and question and answer. Subsequently, the presentation is recorded. We will be archiving it on the Project E3 site. That will take 1 to 2 weeks, just with some pieces we'd like to sort out before we post it. So with that, I believe we are ready to get started. Thanks again for attending. Remember to answer the evaluation form that you will get tomorrow, regardless of whether you're interested in CRC credits. The evaluation forms are quite valuable for us to understand what we should be doing next. So thank you very much, and we will go ahead and get started.
To our second webinar on evolving a trauma-informed service environment, in which we'll explore role-specific approaches to support the healing of trauma. Our agenda for today is to learn how we can leverage motivational interviewing as a trauma-informed style of communication, and also explore how art making can help alleviate the effects of trauma. In webinar 1, we reviewed key aspects of trauma. We did a little refresher on certain trauma impacts. And in webinar 3, the next webinar, we're going to explore more specifically how to create a service environment that is trauma-informed and healing-focused. So in the refresher, the first webinar, we discussed how trauma can be individualized. And what's important for us to know is that our response to a given person's trauma can also be individualized. Our healing can be individualized and needs to be. And one way we can do that is by holding space. And so what does that mean? Well, this young man has gone and broken his arm. Doctors put a cast around his arm. If I was in the room with you, I'd ask you, what is healing his arm? And in short order, usually folks are able to come up with, well, he's sewing, his body is sewing those bones back together. That cast is just there to hold it in place so his body can do the work that it needs to do. And so when I'm sitting down with someone in service to them, this is my frame, and that is that I'm not here to fix it for you. I'm here to hold space for you so that you can figure out how you want to fix it for you. And we identify 3 layers of holding space. The first is just to listen and learn. Who is this person? Where have they been? What has their journey been like? Where do they want to go from here? What are their reasons for doing that? And as that's happening, what I want to do is demonstrate deep understanding, which is our simple and specific definition of empathy. And then once there's enough safety and engagement happening, connection, then I start to guide by responding to certain things that the person is sharing with me, so that they can become more self-aware of that. One of the key aspects of this is listening, and so if I was in a room for you, I'd say, here is the symbol for listening. It's made up of these individual symbols. You wrap them all together and it means listening. What is this symbol for listening trying to tell us about listening? And what most folks are able to tell us is that it takes all parts of us to listen to a person. It is not just the ears. We're also listening with our energy, with our heart, with our eyes, and really drinking in the person from all aspects of us. when I'm in a room with folks and we're exploring this experientially, what we'll do is we'll have them give each other a minute and a half of listening to. And what folks often report when we process this experience is that as the speaker, there's usually two extremes to the experience. One is, oh my God, I thought it would never end. I really needed the listener to say something to me so that I could keep going. And the other extreme is, what, it's over, I was just getting warmed up, nobody ever listens to me. And experiences in between. And so what that tells me is that as a listener, I need to show up for this person. And if they are sharing what they need to share, on topic, focused, relevant to the work that we're doing together, then I just let them go, sit back, listen, check off boxes, whatever it is that I'm doing with them. If the person is hesitant to share with me, if they are guarded, if they're grumpy, if they're just not sure what to share, then that means I need to help them out and say something. Could be a question, could be a reflection, could be something else, which we'll explore here in a little bit. So motivational interviewing is a way of holding space, and we can leverage the skills and concepts in MI to be trauma-informed in our communication. One of the things that we do to kind of get at that is we will have folks pick out a value, something that's important to them. And we will have the speaker share out that value and the listener help the person start to explore that value and deeper and deeper. And what often comes up is that usually I take a vote in the room and I say, how many of you have had a chance to share out your values, to talk about your values in the last week or two? And usually it's pretty consistent, whether it's a room of 10 or 100, 10% of that room has had a chance to talk about their values in the last week or two. And what that tells me is that we often don't get a chance to talk about our values. And what happens when folks talk about their values, they start to define it more for themselves, and it moves from the back of their head up to the front of their head. They become more self-aware of it. And there's this thing called discrepancy that naturally pops up. Discrepancy is a big fancy word for collision. And that is that the person has a positive value and goal, but they have an unhealthy behavior that is in conflict with that positive value and goal. And when they become more self-aware of it, they have a tendency to become more motivated to shift that behavior so it's more aligned with their values. I know this is true of me. Every time when we're in a room, we have an odd number of people, group of people, I will practice this exercise and have this experience. And what comes up for me is that I recognize that I'm not behavioralizing this value at 100%. And so then it starts to kind of bring up for me, boy, how can I do more of this? And so that's one of the chief ways that MI works. It's also one of the chief ways that we guide in the concept of holding space. And so I'm going to read out this client statement here, and your job is to identify what are the positive and healthy values that this person has. I don't want to be lectured about drinking. I know if I'd been pulled over, I could have been fired from my job at the mayor's office. I work a long day, and by the time I get home, I'm exhausted and ready to relax. I'll usually have someone while I'm making dinner. If I don't have the kids, I just fix something quick, kick back, have a couple more drinks, and watch TV. I usually have wine with dinner while I'm cooking, but I make something a little nicer when the kids are there. I'm divorced. Most of the times he has the kids. That's not how it's supposed to be, but he's always been a control freak. So what are this person's positive values? So if I was in a room, most of the time what people are able to identify is that her kids are a big value. Being a good mom is a big value of hers. Having gainful employment is a big value of hers, so that she can provide for the kids. So some ways that we can surface discrepancy, help the person become more self-aware of their discrepancy, is by saying something along the lines of, oh man, you have got a lot going on right now. Tell me more about your kids. Tell me more about your good momness. And then what happens is that the person starts to share out a value. And then oftentimes what happens is the discrepancy will come up on its own. So the person might start to talk more about their kids and being a mom, and they might say, you know, and I know, I get it, you know, if I was drinking less and he wouldn't be able to hold that against me, I'd be able to take him back to court and I'd be able to do something about that. And what we can do is help the person start to pay more and more attention to that, and then they want to do something about it. So another way that we can help this along is by exploring other people's concerns. This is a way that we can kind of help the person become more self-aware of the discrepancy. So in this instance, after we've gotten the person to share out a little bit more about the value, invited them to do so, then we can give them a little summary of what they've shared. So for example, we might say back to them, okay, so you know, it's really important for you to demonstrate to your kids how much they mean to you, how much you love them. And you do this by, you know, working hard so you can provide for them, coming home, making a special dinner for them, taking them out to the park. And your ex has said some things about the drinking. What do other people say about it? What do your kids say about it? Your mom, the cat, whoever's important in the person's life, you invite them to share that out, and then often discrepancy will pop its head out in this way. Another way, and this is sort of a right time, right place, just the right amount of connection is happening. And that is, we ask them a key question. So we give them a summary as we did before, and we invite them to say to us, to answer this question, talk to me a little bit about how the drinking goes along with all that. And then discrepancy might pop its head out. So those are 3 different ways that we can help the person become more aware of this collision, this mismatch between the positive value and the unhealthy behavior. And that's a primary way that motivational interviewing works. And the reason that exploring values is so important is because typically it's at the center of the person. It's tied to who they are. It's at their core. And one of the key questions we ask in this exploration, we have the listeners ask after the person surfaces their value a little bit, is where does that come from? And the reports out from speakers are often that took them to a deep place, a very personal place, because values often come from family, adopted family, tradition, adopted traditions, heritage, culture, who this person is. And that gets into the aspect of identity. And this is a way that MI can be culturally reverent, which will become important in just a moment. So when we're applying motivational interviewing to hold space, what we're really doing is behavioralizing these values of motivational interviewing. And you can see here that that's comprised of compassion, acceptance, partnership, and evocation. Now, what I find about values is that they're pretty worthless unless they show up in someone's behavior, as we just explored. So individuals have values, organizations, systems, programs, agencies have values, and restaurants have values. But again, they're pretty worthless unless they show up in someone's behavior. So for example, I was out to eat with my family a while back, and when everybody's food came except for my son's, and I wondered with the waiter, where's his food? I experienced a high degree of apathy from the waiter. He just didn't seem to care. And so when that continued, I went to the assistant manager and I said, look, I just want to let you know about the experience we're having because it's not a positive one and I thought you might like to know. I also experienced a high degree of apathy from the assistant manager. Now, I'm pretty sure that when you go back to the manager's office, they're framed on the wall as not the following statement: we will treat every customer who comes through our doors with absolute apathy. I'm pretty sure it says something different than that, but I couldn't tell because it wasn't coming up in anybody's behavior. So these are only as good as they show up in our behavior. The first stop here is compassion, and I understand compassion from a story that Father Gregory Boyle tells. And Father Gregory Boyle is a selfless Jesuit priest who lives out in East LA, and he's dedicated his whole life to helping gang members get out of gangs. And he's done this through the creation of a sustainable business called Homeboy Industries, which is basically a bakery where folks that are involved in gangs can develop some soft skills and then move on with their life in a more healthy and generative way. It's been very successful. And in his book, Tattoos on the Heart, he tells of his first encounter with Juanita. He says, I was a little discombobulated. I was getting ready for a baptism, and Juanita, who I'd never met before, plows into my office, plops down in my chair, and she starts unloading on me. And she says, I need to stop running the streets. I need to get out of the gangs. And she goes on. She says, I need to stop using heroin. Sometimes I prostitute myself just so I can get money so I can buy heroin. And she goes on. And she says, I started using heroin straight out of high school, and I've been trying to stop ever since. And then she stops, and she pauses, and tears well up in her eyes. And she looks at Father Gregory Boyle dead in the eye, and she says, I am a disgrace. And Father Gregory Boyle, telling the story, says, and it was at this moment that our shame met. For when she had walked into the room, I had mistaken her for a distraction. And so, Father Gregory Boyle, this very selfless Jesuit priest, of which I am neither, says, you know what? If I'm going to choose to do this, then I need to choose to show up for whoever shows up, whenever they show up, whatever they show up with. And so I take him up on that offer, and that is to choose to show up for this person in their best interest. Now, if I'm going to do that, then I need to choose to show up for myself. And for me, what that means is getting out into the woods, away from screens, sometimes from other humans, and just walking through trees, and going camping, going hiking, going on bike rides, going for a walk. These things help me fill up my compassion bucket. Now, bugs and small animals sometimes preclude people from getting out in nature, which is cool. And what that means is that we need to each find our own way to have a wellness plan that helps us fill up our compassion bucket so we can choose to show up in this way. When I am in a place of compassion, this allows me to be in a place of acceptance. And the primary elements of our acceptance are recognizing that the person has a choice, recognizing their autonomy. Autonomy is a very fancy word for choice. And when I do this, it allows them to take ownership for their choices, for their behavior, instead of me imposing that on them. The other key aspect of acceptance is affirmation. That is recognizing the strength and efforts that a person has been putting forth that might help them move forward in their life in a different way. Sometimes they're not even aware of the strengths and efforts that are there for them, inherent in them. And treating everybody with respect and dignity, another key aspect of acceptance. And the last piece of acceptance that I feel is probably, to me, the most important, and that is my capacity to express empathy to this person, which is deep understanding of their perspective, of their world, versus my judgment on it. When I'm in a place of acceptance, this allows me to be in a place of partnership. So I want you to sit with this question, and that is, when you're serving someone, how do you know that they are experiencing partnership with you? What are some key indicators that partnership is happening? Oftentimes what people come up with is they show up, they talk to me, they tell me important stuff, they tell me the good stuff, and an even better indicator of partnership is they tell me when things haven't gone so well this week. And in MI, we describe this as a collaboration of experts. There's the person's the expert on their life, where they've been and where they want to go and who they are. And we are the expert on some concepts, skills, ideas that might help them move forward with that. And so we want to merge these two expertises together to journey on. Now, in a given role, I might just be expressing partnership, acceptance, compassion. I might not be evoking a lot, which we'll get to in just a second. And so I experience this spirit on a dial. Sometimes I'm dialed up just to partnership, acceptance, and compassion, and sometimes I'm dialed all the way up to evocation. And evocation is when we're drawing out from the person that which is already there. We're listening for and responding to certain things that the person is saying. Now, evocation comes with another story, and it's another true story. So out east, there's this big old giant statue of the Buddha. It's a plaster Buddha, ugly old thing. And one day in the 1950s, a monk was walking by it. He noticed a piece of plaster had chipped off, and there's something glinting underneath. And so he got curious and he started to pick away the plaster. And in short order, he had uncovered the largest solid gold Buddha in existence. And so again, this is a true story. So what happened? Well, 500 years earlier, the country was in disarray, a bunch of marauders running around melting down golden Buddhas. And so what the monks did to protect it was make it ugly so nobody would want it. And this is what happens with people who have experienced trauma. They have experiences in their life that make them want to plaster up because their experiences with other humans have typically been painful. And over time, that plaster sets in, and they even forget that maybe they've done it, not even aware of it. And so what the process of evocation is allowing the person to chip away at that plaster to let all that healthfulness and generativeness peek out. So the reason that the spirit is so important, in my opinion, is that if I'm part of a team of 10 or an agency of 300 or a system of 20,000, if everybody's operating in this vibe, then what's going to happen is that the person is going to feel safe with us. And then over time, that's going to expand into trust. So if you are operating in this vibe and doing a great job of making me feel safe, and I'm trusting our work together, and then you go on vacation and Frank shows up, Frank, who is not operating in this vibe, he's operating in a contrary vibe, then all that trust you've built up goes back to zero. Now we can repair that and regain it. However, why take steps back when we can continue to move forward? So when people are from the person who greets me in the waiting room to the direct service provider to the CEO, accounting, security personnel, on and on and on, are operating in this vibe, then things settle in. Plus, the team becomes more cohesive too. That's been my experience with this. These are the most commonly embraced values of the trauma-informed care implementation, which we've explored before. But just to remind us, that's safety, trust, collaboration, transparency, empowerment, cultural, historical, and gender responsiveness. And this is how we see them aligning with the spirit of MI. And we can see here how they just fold together like a nice deck of cards. And that when I am practicing acceptance, I'm helping the person feel safe with me. I am increasing the trust between us. I am being respectful, their self-ascribed identity. This gets into cultural reverence. When that's all happening, then partnership, collaboration, transparency, a way of being collaborative starts to unfold. And then when I'm invoking, I'm empowering, because I'm sourcing the person's power versus installing it. One way that we can behavioralize this spirit is how we share information. And so when I'm sitting down with someone, I've got an idea for them about something, I'm going to find out from them what they already know. So I'm going to discover what they already know. And so I might say to a person, what do you already know about what employers are looking for in an employee? The reason that I'm doing that, as you'd be able to tell me, is because if I tell someone what they already know, then that's disengaging. I mean, just think about it. What happens to you when somebody tells you something you already know? It tends to put us off, it feels dismissive, these kinds of things come up, and that's not what we want. So we want to find out what the person already knows first. Then we want to affirm what we agree with in regards to what they've shared with us, and then ask them permission to share out a little more. So I might say, yeah, that's a great list. And I'd be specific about identifying that, yeah, employers are looking for somebody who shows up on time. Is it okay if I add on to your list? So I asked them permission. Of course, the reason I'm doing that is because that's an explicit way of partnering. I want to make sure that they're ready for it. I don't know about you, but I've given plenty of ideas to folks over the years, and I could literally see it bouncing off of their cranium. You know, it just wasn't going in. And so I want to make sure that the person's ready to hear any ideas I might have. The other is that it shifts our brain. This is a belief I have based on my experience of this, and that is a colleague of mine wanted to test pilot. She had just learned brain spotting, which is a trauma resolution technique, and she needed someone to test it out with. practice with, and so I said, I'll do that. So I came in, we had about a 40-minute session, and then we were processing after the session was done, and then she said, I have an idea, is it okay if I share it with you? And I said, sure. And I noticed that my brain went from processing mode to receiving mode. And so that's another benefit of asking someone permission to give them an idea. So once I get permission, then I simply say, here is an idea versus 10 ideas. And as you'd be able to tell me, the reason I'm doing that is because I don't want to overwhelm them. You know, folks that have experienced trauma discombobulated in the brain. And so we want to make sure that we're layering in information in bite-sized chunks. And the other reason is if they don't like that idea, then it informs the next idea I might share with them. And as soon as I share with them that idea, I immediately put the ball back in their court by saying, what do you think of that? So it's pretty simple. Discover what they already know, affirm and ask, tell them something, ask them what they think about it. Now, one of the things that we shared out with you in the first webinar was a list of grounding techniques. And I want to give you a sense of how we might use this structure of discover, affirm, ask, tell, ask to onboard someone to a grounding technique. So I'm going to give my one-man show on how that sounds. Frank, it's good to see you again. Hey, Sean, it's good to see you. Frank, I notice that you're grounded and ready to have a substantive and meaningful conversation today. Oh yeah, Sean, I'm good to go. Frank, I've also noticed on other days you come in, you're a little discombobulated and we don't get very far. Oh yeah, I've noticed that too, Sean. Say, Frank, I think it'd be helpful for us to identify a way that you can cool your jets and return to the present moment so we can have more conversations when you are a little discombobulated. What do you think of that? Oh, that sounds good. So tell me a little bit about that, Frank. How do you already cool your jets? Oh, I really love to listen to death metal and thrash about. That's awesome, Frank. I'm glad you've got that in your life. We can't really do that in my office, so I have this handy list of grounding techniques. I'm wondering if you'd be up for perusing it and picking one out. Sure, Sean. How about this one? That's a beauty. So how about we practice it for a second? Sounds good. We practice it, see how it sits with Frank. If he likes it, then we say, great. So if you come in and you're a little discombobulated, I might invite us to ground. Or if you're noticing you're discombobulated and want to ground, then you can simply tell me I need to ground, and we'll do that. And so now we have a plan. And we made that in partnership. And you know, a lot of things that I share out are things that I wish I would have known when I was running the emergency room that was Project Excel, which was an alternative day treatment program for adjudicated juveniles, so kids, adolescents that were 1 foot away of being placed in juvenile prison, often gang involved, often rival gangs in the same building. And so everybody who came through the door around intake would have an identified grounding technique that works for them. All the staff, including me, would have a grounding technique that worked for them. And so we can use this to onboard folks to a grounding technique so that we can address any triggers that are happening. The other way that we can use this in regards to trauma is we can use it to help people understand how trauma shows up in any human, and we can tie it back to specific examples within them by saying something along the line of, what do you already know about trauma and its impact on humans? Have them share that out and then provide some additional information. Oftentimes the way that we provide that additional information in regards to how trauma works on a person is through the use of a story or a metaphor. And this can be very helpful in just making it very simple for people to connect with. And so when we're in a room and we're exploring that specific idea, what folks have come up with have to do with tea kettles, boiling water, air balloons, water balloons, radiators, grilled cheese sandwiches, which I didn't quite get, but the person got it, and that's what matters. And so that's another way that we can use this structure. Now, when we're behavioralizing the spirit of MI, the verbal behaviors that we're using to do that are often referred to as the OARS. And so maybe you've heard of the OARS before, but I'm going to introduce you to the OARS. And the reason that we slid deep listening in there is because it is probably the most important thing. after I ask a question is to listen. After I throw out an affirmation or reflection, to listen. I'm going to give you a brief overview of these, just so that we have same pageness in regards to what they mean. So open-ended questions, as you know, are the opposite of a closed-ended question. And so when Ileana, my daughter, was 16 and she'd come home from school and I say, "Did you have a good day at school?" This was an invitation from me to her to say yes or no. It's a closed-ended question. If I said to her, "How was your day?" this would be an invitation from me to my 16-year-old daughter to share out the richness and diversity of her day, to which she would usually reply, "Fine, it's good," right? So I'm not getting a whole lot of intel out of this beautifully open-ended question. So sometimes we need to dial in our open-ended questions just a bit. So I might have said, "How's band class? How's math?" Or "How's Benny?" Any one of those things. And she might have started to share out a little more intel with me. Affirmations are when we specifically identify a strength and or an effort that the person has been putting forth, such as, "Wow, you put in a lot of applications last week, and that really shows your investment in getting a job and starting to provide for your family the way that you shared you want to." So that's a specific and meaningful affirmation. If I say, "Good job, way to go, attaboy," nothing wrong with that, it's just not very specific. Reflections are when we share out a guess, that is founded on what the person is implying by their words and what our intuition is telling us, and we add those things together and out comes a reflection. And so in regards to the person statement before about the mom and the kids and the divorce and the drinking, I might say, "Ooh, you've got a lot going on and you're really trying hard to figure out how you can get the kids with you full time." Now, if you look back at that statement, those aren't the exact words she said. It's getting a little deeper meaning in regards to what she was sharing. And that's the best kind of reflection. It's what we call a complex reflection, and those reflections typically express empathy and can also do some other things. Summaries are basically a collection of reflections, sometimes ending with a question, sometimes with an affirmation thrown in. So the basic difference between a reflection and a summary is length. Reflections are about 3 to 7 words long. Summaries are getting into paragraph land. One of the most powerful verbal behaviors is reflections, because when we're expressing empathy, this is us showing the person, demonstrating to the person that we get it. Instead of saying, "I get it," we get it and then we demonstrate it, that we understand things from their perspective. And this is what allows safety to settle in. And this graphic that you see here is actually based on a 20-minute TED Talk from Brene Brown, which I invite you to see because it's really awesome. And she says the first place that we need to get to is safety. And once we have safety, this allows people to be vulnerable. Now, I experience vulnerability, healthy vulnerability, as being at the ocean. What will happen sometimes is that people will walk up and just kind of look at the ocean. Some people will dip their toe in. Some people will jump right in. Our job is to help people feel the willingness and safety of going out into this ocean of vulnerability deeper and deeper. When that's happening, what's happening is that the person is allowing themselves to be seen, what's really going on with them. And that is what happened. That's what helps connection happen between this person being served and the service provider. Now, this graphic here is from a meta-study, which is a study of studies. And this was not a study that was specific to motivational interviewing. The question they were asking the data is, what is it that contributes to the positive outcome between any helper to serve person relationship? And what they found out is that these things on the left mattered a whole lot, and the things on the right not so much. So what mattered a whole lot? Alliance, rapport, connection, the ability of the practitioner to express empathy, goal consensus. So in motivational interviewing, what we call that is focus. And we always want to identify the focus of the conversation with the person in partnership. Collaboration, partnership. Positive regard, affirmation. Genuineness, being real, so being conversational and not techniquey. And the congruence. And congruence is the sum total of all these things, and that the person gets that I get them. Again, what mattered less was if I was going to be developing a life or delivering a life skills group. It would matter less which curriculum I picked off the shelf to deliver. It would matter more how I'm delivering the curriculum. So it matters more how we're doing what we're doing. And here's a quote from Bessel van der Kolk in his quote, "The body keeps a score." So I'll just read it out for us. Finally, we know that trauma is shrouded in secrecy and denial and is often ignored. Nobody wants to talk about interpersonal violence. Both women and men who have been physically or sexually assaulted are afraid to talk about their experiences for fear that they would be mislabeled, mistreated, or simply not believed. And in some cases, their fears are well-founded. And so this is another reason why it's really important for me to be able to take the person's perspective, sit with them in acceptance, which is the absence of judgment. It's non-judgment, so that the person feels held, so that they feel heard and accepted for their experiences. Because if I judge a person, then what I'm doing is I'm reinforcing their shame. Typically, when folks have experiences of trauma, they have the option between this crappy choice and that crappy choice in a moment. And so what they have to make a choice. And oftentimes that choice is one they might later regret for whatever reason. And even though they were in an awful situation. And there's all types of trauma that come up from that. And what results is shame. And this concept here is again from Brene Brown. And that is that she says that if you take shame and you put it into a petri dish and you add secrecy, judgment, and silence to it, it will grow. But if you take shame and you put it into a petri dish and you add empathy to it, it will shrink. And so we want to give shame a big empathy hug so that it dissipates and the person can share more with us. So how holding space heals is that it establishes a sense of safety and trust when we are skillful in our capacity to leverage the verbal behavior reflections to express empathy. When we have this vibe across a team, as I said before, it can help us identify the focus of a conversation being reconnecting to a community. So I don't experience that as a big, giant, involved thing. It can be a very simple thing. So, for example, when Ileana was 16, she was a big fan of Doctor Who. And Doctor Who, as you may know, is a television program that once in a while shows up in the theater. So I took her down to the theater, the big house here in Milwaukee, and every seat was filled. I never seen it so packed, and everybody was decked out in their Doctor Who gear. And I turned to Ileana and I said, I don't know if you're still trying to find the rest of your crew, but I believe they're all here tonight. And so that's really about what reconnecting with the community is about. It's about finding a group of people that like to geek out on that which you like to geek out. Obviously, 12-step groups are super helpful in this regard, but also meetup groups, which is an app and also online, and just plugging in what folks like to do and seeing what groups are around where they can go hang out with them can be a very simple healing process. Dungeons and Dragons groups can be a healing process. There's a book called Tribe on Homecoming and Belonging by Sebastian Junger. And Sebastian Junger is a war correspondent and a war veteran. And in this book, he shares out a lot of concepts in regard to how important it is to heal as a part of a community. And he gives two data points that really jump out at me, and they're both from World War II. And one is that when the London officials knew that Germany was about to start bombing London, they thought, oh man, everybody's going to freak out. It's going to be mass chaos and anarchy in the streets. But what they found out happened instead was that people came together to soldier on. Families had an option of sending their children out to an estate in the countryside where they wouldn't experience the bombing, but the family couldn't come with them. The parents couldn't come with them. And they did a study after the war, and they found out that those kids who stayed in London and experienced the bombing with their parents had higher rates of resilience than those kids that were displaced from their parents and did not experience the bombing. And resilience, of course, is that capacity to bounce back and heal from a trauma. When we're evoking, we are empowering because we're sourcing that which is already there. We're plugging people back into their power by helping them become more self-aware of their capacities and reasons to change and heal. As we explored, we're partnering with people to provide education on the effects of the trauma through Discover, Affirm, and Ask, Tell, and Ask. Same thing with helping them find a grounding technique, that which allows them return to now, homeostasis, to balance. As we're doing all of that, what we're doing is helping the person rewire their brain. Marianne often may have shared this in the first webinar, but the concept that when we're wiring our brains, it kind of starts out as a dirt path. And the more we use that path, that neural pathway in the brain, then it starts to, get asphalted, and then it becomes a super highway. When we don't use neural pathways, such as the one that leave us in scripts, then it degenerates back down to a path and eventually isn't used as much. And so in this way, you are all brain surgeons, so make sure you put that on your resume. Now, when we're behavioralizing the spirit with folks and helping them feel safe with us, what we're doing is giving someone an opportunity to see and feel what it's like to be in a healthy professional relationship. And then they can take that and expand it out to other people in their lives so they can make better choices, more helpful choices in regards to who they're connecting with out in the world. And as they heal up this invisible wound of trauma and it becomes this scar that no longer influences their behavior, they can start to sit with, what do I want to do with this experience? How do I want to carry it forward in a positive and healthy way? And then we can affirm that post-traumatic growth. So that is a brief overview of how we can apply motivational interviewing to hold space for folks that have experienced trauma and be healing in our service relationships. And now, Marianne is going to share with us how art can help heal trauma.
There is a pain so utter it swallows substance up, then covers the abyss with trance so memory can step around, across, upon it, as one within a swoon goes safely where an open eye would drop him bone by bone.
Hi, I'm Marianne, and I'm here to talk to you today about art therapy. What is it? How is it beneficial? Who can utilize it? Why it's so effective with trauma, and what can be done about it if you're not an art therapist. So let's begin. So I'm going to tell a story. So I'm going to tell a story about a little girl that I worked with, and I worked with her in over the course of many years, several years. And what had happened was she was about 5 years old. Mom was pregnant, married to dad, kind of a middle class mom, dad, child together unit. And so this little girl, mom gave birth, and mom gave birth to twins, and the twins were born premature. So they were in the hospital for quite some time, and they ended up staying at a Ronald McDonald house because the children that were born were so premature. One of them had a heart condition, which eventually took his life. So this little girl, and I'm going to call her Rita, which is not her name, but it's a beautiful name. So Rita was really struggling, and Rita was having nightmares. Rita was acting out. Rita was really just not herself. And I came into the picture because mom said, I don't know what to do. Like, she's not sleeping, she's not eating, she's acting out, she's, hitting, she's just uncomfortable and acting out. So I worked with her, and one of the first things we did is she was telling me she was having nightmares, and the nightmares were this two-headed monster that was eating her parents and was coming after her. So as an art therapist, and I'm working with this young girl, and we create out of plaster casting, the two-headed monster, right? And this two-headed monster, the thing that she couldn't tell us was it had no arms and no legs. And it didn't really have teeth. So it was this kind of blob of this monster. And as you can imagine, like it was this blob with two heads and it had very unhappy faces on it. And it was painted in all these like mix mash of colors, right? And what became obvious was that what she was having nightmares about was being a sibling that felt forgotten, as mom and dad understandably had to spend time in the neonatal intensive care unit with their twins, one of whom had a heart disorder, a heart anomaly. They spent as much time with her as they could, but in their own emotional response to this situation, they were very disconnected and struggling. And so she felt like she had lost her parents. And she had lost her parents to this two-headed monster, aka twins, who were born and living in the NICU. So we make this monster and we start to process this kind of stuff. And the monster is no longer haunting her in her dreams, but it's now living out here. So she starts to make gifts and as I process with the parents are like, oh, this is helpful. We'll get her more involved with the twins so that she can understand, this is a caregiving thing. And as she got more involved, she started to make gifts for her monster. And then she changed the color, from all these mishmash of colors to purple, et cetera, et cetera. So one day she comes back to the Ronald McDonald House and she's visibly upset. Her mom is visibly upset. And I say, well, what's going on? What happened? And the little girl says, I need to make my mom happy. My mom is very sad today and I need to make her a picture so that she can be happy again. And she makes this picture. Now what we're seeing in this picture, by all accounts, the colors are bright. We can kind of see a rainbow and a sun is there, and there seems to be flowers everywhere, right? If we look at a 5-year-old and they made us this picture, we'd say like, wow, that 5-year-old had a lot of energy, but all just really great, happy colors, right? And that's a common response. I think as adults who aren't art therapists would look at this and say, well, that's a pretty happy picture, Marianne. I don't know what you're looking at. But what I saw was something very different, and it caused me to give question to the mom as to what was going on, and it turned out they had received news that the twin with the heart anomaly was not going to live. Rita did not know this, mom did. Mom was sad. Rita just wanted to make mom happy, but Rita was, vicariously traumatized by mom's sadness. So she makes this picture, and here's what I see. I see a rainbow that is sort of all over the place, right? Like it doesn't fit into the neat lines, and it's really small and it's not connected. And I see a sun that's sort of in the middle of the picture, which kids that age will typically put the sun in the corner, right? So there's a little bit of understanding where kids make art developmentally. And I'm looking at those flowers, and the flowers that have stems don't have petals. And the flowers that have petals, which are little cutout pieces of paper, don't have stems. And look at the ground, right? It's up, it's down, it's disappeared, it's up, it's down. And for me, when I look at this picture, the first image or the first thing that comes to mind is a tornado went through the Crayola factory. It has a lot of energy to it and it feels disconnected. So I worked with Rita on a variety of things. We started connecting things. So we did some sewing projects. We did some weaving projects. She made little pillows for the twins as well as for herself, and one for mom and dad. And she put love notes inside of each of these pillows. They're like little felt pillows with the big thick needle and the yarn, right? So super simple stuff, very age appropriate. And she started reconnecting. She started connecting things. And we worked through the grieving process. We worked through her grief and her understanding of it. Eventually her brother did pass. And through this creative process and working again in the metaphor of what was happening, we ended up getting to this place, and this was one of our last art therapy sessions, and I knew it was going to be one of our last because this is the image that came up. So this image, as you can see, this rainbow is very well organized. It's large, it expands the paper. But notably, you can see the remainders of the sun that was in the corner, so it's in the right spot. And when we look at the ground, it's straight across. It's stable. It's feeling stable. Now, when I look at this, let's compare them together. Let's put them together. Look at the difference in the energy expression of these two pieces of art made by the same child, about 4 months apart. The first one feels absolutely frenetic. It has a lot of energy. It has a lot of expression. It has a lot of catharsis going on, right? A lot of that emotion is coming out on the page, and it's really feeling scattered. And as we work through this process, we ended up with this last image, which by comparison to the first image feels incredibly peaceful. It's simple, it's calm, the sky is blue, the sun is where it's supposed to be, the rainbow expands the whole page. And when we look at the comparison of these two images, we can see how art therapy is beneficial to this young child, and we can sort of translate that into how it might be beneficial for adults as well. So the next question is, when we understand how art therapy works, how it's beneficial, it's easy to find art therapists. A Google search on the American Art Therapy Association has an art therapy locator. So if you sense that someone is struggling or you're having a hard time understanding, that their words don't necessarily match with the emotions they're expressing, you can certainly make that recommendation. But there are some things that you can do as well that can help all of your clients. They're very simple things. One thing that has come into play recently is the advent of adult coloring books. Engage people in the coloring books. If you work in an office that has a small budget, but you can buy these. You can buy these online. You can buy them at Barnes & Noble. Stock up on some coloring books and some colored pencils, really relatively inexpensive. Journaling also helps. Writing out that there's something about the hand-eye coordination and the tactile experience of writing that is beneficial. So, no matter who you're serving, if it's someone coming in, looking for a job, if it's someone coming in who's just looking for some guidance or assistance, you can offer them some things that are very grounding. So using one of the adult coloring books or a journal can be very grounding. Another thing that I find that people really enjoy across the board is doing collage. Not everybody feels like they can draw or color or they feel capable in that way, but looking at images that already exist and cutting them out can be really helpful. One of the things that I like to work with a lot of different people on is creating vision boards. What do you want your life to look like? And you can look through magazines, cut out some images, and these images are going to tell you a story of what you're working towards, which can be really helpful, especially if they're looking towards a career, something that is meaningful, where they feel that there maybe is a sense of purpose, which would be ideal. What do you want that to look like? And you can create those images. So there's an image that I've included as one of the slides of a collage, and it says, maybe all you need is a little encouragement. And sometimes images like this can serve as a reminder. So there's a lot of different things that you can do creatively that can help the people that you serve sort of come back down to a homeostasis, start to decompress from whatever stresses it is that they're feeling. It might be coloring with a colored pencil, might be doing some adult coloring books. The mandalas are always nice. They're so easily available. It might be filling a page with color. Really a very simple technique and it doesn't take any special skill. Literally just taking one color and going back and forth. That rhythm can be very relaxing, and just fill the page with color. When you're done, flip it over, choose another color, fill the page with color. Super simple, very easy, no skills needed. Or maybe it's scribbling. You know what? I feel like you have a lot of energy today. I'm going to give you these crayons, and I just want you to scribble on the page, and we're just going to throw it away when you're done. It works great. I do this with adults often. If they have an excess of energy, let's just scribble. And I'll encourage them to hold the utensils inappropriately, right? So instead of holding as we would if we're drawing, I have them hold it in a fist as I would if I were a child. And just really just scribble and get that out. Knowing that at the end of this scribble, we're just gonna rip that up and throw it away. We just have to get the emotion out, and then we can focus moving forward. So there's some ideas on how you might be able to use the creative process to work with the people that you serve. Again, whether it's coloring in a book, journaling, creating a vision board, or using collage, or maybe just scribbling on a page. These things are accessible. It doesn't take much other than a piece of printer paper and maybe a couple of crayons or colored pencils. So, how does art therapy help someone with trauma? When we're looking at the creative side or the emotional processing side of the brain, and it's also the creative side, when we make art, we are starting to release that. We are starting to release that chemical. We are starting to release those emotions. And the beautiful thing about art is it takes what is here, all of these images. So when we think about trauma and how it stores in the brain, it stores in the brain as images. It is nightmares, right? Trauma comes out in nightmares. Trauma comes out in daydreaming about negative things, ruminating, if you will. Trauma comes out in paranoia, which can be sort of images in the periphery, if you will. I think something is happening. I think people are looking at me. I think this might be happening. So it's a perception of images in the periphery based on what images are stored in the mind. And then we also have hypervigilance, which is that same sort of thing, but it manifests in a little bit different behavior. So when we look at effects of trauma and loss as images that are stuck in the brain, then one of the ways that we can help ourselves is to create images outside of our brain. So let's draw it out. Let's color. Let's fill the page with color. When I worked at Children's Hospital and I worked with the traumatized children, a lot of times what I would do is I'd fill a huge piece of paper or a huge table with one piece of paper, and I would just put out all sorts of crayons and markers and whatnot, and I would just say, your job is to fill this table with art, like just go. And they would just run around and scribble and scribble and scribble and scribble and scribble, and they'd get messy and their hands were in it. So it was tactile stimulation and it was choice over what colors to use, and they would just burn off this energy as a complete and total raw catharsis. And I knew that they had gone through the other side of catharsis when they would start to make shapes, right? Shapes is a logic thing. So at that point, I could say, all right, let's sit down and make a different image now. For me as an art therapist, I engage adults in art making. And again, what it does from the brain standpoint is it takes the images that are here and it brings them out and puts it in front of us so that they're touchable and they're tangible, and I can change them and I can control them. So it shifts our locus of control from outside to in while taking the thing that is usurping our control from the inside and putting it out. Now, art therapy, we also talk about the images that we create. So we're having this creative experience, right, which is releasing that one side of the brain. And then we're talking about the art that we're looking at. So we're igniting the other side of the brain. We're starting to reason. And we're starting to process the emotions because now we can see them and we can talk about them, and that equals processing. So when we look at how art therapy is beneficial towards healing trauma or starting to reconcile those issues of trauma, one of the major things it's doing is that it's engaging that right side, that creative emotional side. It's engaging the left side, the language and the logic side at the same time, and then it's finally engaging the prefrontal lobe. So the whole brain is coming back online. The research has shown that, and this was research done by art therapists, where they measured cortisol levels in the brain. Again, cortisol is a stress hormone, and they did a study that measured, I don't even know how many people, but they found that 40 minutes of art making, 40 minutes of creativity reduced cortisol levels in the brain measurably. So when you think about that, cortisol is a stress hormone. It gets kind of stuck in overproduction when the amygdala swells and we can't access all parts of the brain. And this is when trauma is an issue and we develop things like PTSD. And then we find that, oh, art making actually reduces that cortisol level, shrinks the amygdala. Art therapy brings in the language aspect and brings it all together. The most simplified version of what art therapy is this. Art speaks when words can't. Another very simple definition of art therapy is any engagement in creativity that guides a person to where they want to be. That's how I like to define it. This is what I call the epitome of what art therapy is. This image speaks volumes as to what is happening. I'm going to tell you a little story behind it. This is when I worked at Children's Hospital. And this was a young teenager who was given a diagnosis of cancer. She was really struggling with it, and parts of her brain, which I will get to shortly, just went offline. She did not have words for how she was speaking, and the only emotion that she was capable of accessing was anger. And so as each staff member came into the room, she would throw things at them. She would threaten them with more violence. She would swear at them. And just by some good fortune, I entered the room on a day when maybe she had finished throwing things at other people, and I encouraged her to make art. And it took a lot of paint and a lot of pieces of paper, and she just made a mess after a mess after a mess after a mess. And once she started getting all of this stuff out, I had a little form, and she took the form and she traced this form on the page. And once she put that form on the page, she finally just broke down and started to cry. And as you can see from this image, it's such a powerful image. This spoke volumes to what she could not express other than through her anger. It shows someone who's feeling lost, not grounded, and just overwhelmed by the muck of what is around her. After this image, we did some other work, and through art therapy, honestly, and other things that were going on, just kind of coming to terms and acceptance, she was able to fight her cancer versus giving up because of the diagnosis. So again, the image to me epitomizes the definition of art therapy, that when words fail, art speaks. I hope this has been informative for you, that you've gotten something out of what art therapy is, how it's used, how you might find an art therapist if you know someone who might benefit from one, and then things that you can do on your own that might help, whether it's you or the people that you serve.
Hi, everyone. My name is Beth Gertner. I work at SVRI and have been working on Project E3 for a few years now. I'm going to run the Q&A today. Thank you, people who've already posted your questions in the Q&A box. For those of you who do have questions and haven't posted yet, you can find that box on the bottom toolbar of your screen. Also, I have slightly spotty internet today. So, Sean and Marianne, if I cut out, please let me know right away, and I might try and take myself off video and try a few different things. Okay, we'll start with the first question. And that one, I believe, is for you, Sean. Actually, this one could probably go to both of you. But the question is, what can you do if a member of the team is not respectful towards the participant or not doing their part in service provision?
Yeah. So this gets at the concept for me of implementation, which means that when we're trying to establish this healing focused vibe, then we need to think about it as a journey. And with any employee, that journey starts with hiring. And so one of the first things we can do is simple behavioral hiring practices. One of the things that we did at an organization of 300 that I was the director of operations, director of training for, was to insert into the phone interview a client statement. and then the person, the candidate, was invited to share back to the client statement, much like the one you heard in the webinar. Just let us know that you're listening to this person. And if they started to fix the person, give them a bunch of ideas, that sort of thing, then they would be coached minimally and said, no, you're kind of fixing there a little bit. Can you just respond as though you're listening? And this was a way of simply measuring how empathetic this person is. It is not impossible to teach someone to be empathetic. However, it is very challenging. And so when you hire folks based on their capacity to be empathetic, then you're a long way down the road in regards to establishing this vibe and, you know, kind of coming into the culture and being able to manifest that vibe right away. And years later, I was at, you know, Bill Miller's the guy who made up motivational interviewing. And it was actually a year later, we were at the big MI conference, and he was there speaking, and I raised my hand because he had mentioned he did something similar. And I said, you know, how do you do that? And he said, well, we give them a client statement and ask them to respond as though they're listening. So this is validated by the guy who made up MI. And so that's one piece, is how we start the journey. Then part of an implementation is to ensure that when, you know, like at this agency of 300, we had an implementation plan. And so within 90 days, anyone who was new had access to the MI training. And as it's integrated with trauma-informed care, such as, you know, we got a taste of on the webinar today. And then there were peer learning groups. And so when you have this establishment as a team leader, what you have is a capacity to go back to this person who's not operating the vibe and saying, what did you get out of those trainings? You know, what is your takeaway in regards to the culture that we're trying to establish here? This best word I have for it is vibe. And so those are a couple of ideas on that. And if that isn't responsive to the person's question, I invite them to re-ask it or let me know how I can do better at that.
Great, thank you. And Sean, I have a couple of real quick questions to throw your way, and then I'm going to toss it over to Marianne for a couple. The first one is just someone was asking if they could get a copy of the list of grounding techniques that you had mentioned.
Oh, of course, yeah, and I'll get those over to you, and we'll get them out. Mm-hmm.
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll post those with the archived webcast so that people are able to access them and the other materials. And then just a quick clarifying question. The TED Talk that you had mentioned, I believe it was the Brene Brown TED Talk. Somebody was asking what the title of that TED Talk was, so it was easier for them to find.
I think if you well, there's two easy ways to do this. If you go to YouTube and just put in Brene Brown vulnerability, there'll be two 20-minute TED Talks that pop, and so one of them will be the right one, and the other one will be worth listening to as well. You can also go to the Shared Training website and click on resources, and we have video resources, which are just a link to a YouTube playlist. And then there's also the books that I mentioned and didn't have time to mention, that just goes to an Amazon idea list. So those are, and I can send you the link, and so you can send it out with the grounding techniques too.
Sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Marianne, I have a couple of questions for you. There's actually two people who chimed in wondering, in regards to art therapy, if you could talk a little bit about how to work with individuals who are blind or visually impaired.
Thank you. Absolutely. Just making sure my mic is on. Yeah, there we go. So art therapy, the wonderful thing about art therapy is it expands beyond just painting and drawing, right? There's a lot of people who do work with folks with varying abilities, including being vision impaired. And there we tend to work with more sculptural ideas or tactile. So working with clays, working with model magic. And even there, you know, you can add paint. Paint in itself, it has a really visceral feel. And so what we're doing is we're engaging that emotional expression through touch versus sight and touch. So there are a variety of ways, you know, whether it's water, sand, anything that offers a texture that can be expressive to that person.
Yeah, great. And thank you, people who are responding in chat. You guys are really on top of it. It looks like the Brene Brown TED Talk is called The Power of Vulnerability. And somebody, it looks like, included the link already. So A+ for the audience today. All right, next question. Sorry, I just got to flip over here. This one is for Sean. Says, do you have a resource for applying MI to acute crisis situations?
Yeah, so the way that I share MI is it's contextual. And what that means is, like, one of the things we talked about was the focus of the conversation. And so for different providers, they're going to have different focuses or foci. And so, like, I'm a non-clinical, or was a non-clinical provider. So I wouldn't be doing the work that Mary Ann's doing, but I would work with the person to get ready and wanting to go visit someone like Mary Ann to heal their trauma. So for a crisis situation, it's really a lot about the partnership, acceptance, compassion stuff to dial them down. And then once they're dialed down, then we can get into how would you like to go about handling the situation differently next time? And then that's when we would get into the evocation process. So the focus is, we often refer to as the target behavior. What is the behavior that needs to shift in order for this person to start to work on managing their open wound of trauma, coping through it, but then also healing it. And so in a crisis situation, that is, how do we want to handle next time? And again, if that isn't responsive to the person's question, I invite them to ask it a different way, or let me know how I missed it.
Yeah, definitely. And that's true for everyone. If we didn't quite get your question answered the way you would like, or if you have a follow-up or something like that, feel free to post again in Q&A. We're definitely more than happy to follow up. The next question comes from George. Looks like this one's for you, Sean. Says, I understand the importance of letting a client know that you get where they're coming from. I've seen from experience that sometimes the only way to show the client that you get it is to agree with their point of view. How can we show someone that we see where they're coming from without necessarily agreeing with them if their thoughts are detrimental to themselves?
Yeah, so this is a really helpful distinction, and that is, expressing empathy is not about agreement. Expressing empathy is basically, I get it. I understand it from your perspective, and demonstrating that. Because I can say I can get it all the time to you, but that doesn't necessarily demonstrate to you that I'm really getting it. And so that's where reflections come in super handy, because it's a demonstration to the person that we're getting it from their perspective. And sometimes, like with adolescents or folks with cognitive challenges, I want to be a little bit more clear that I'm reflecting. And so what I might say, okay, yeah. So for you, it's really that the manager was doing this and that pissed you off, and that's why you threw the rag at him. And so I put in a little thing at the beginning that clearly indicates to the person that I'm describing their experience of it. And once the person says, yeah, that's exactly it. Once, I've validated that I'm tuned in, they've validated that I'm tuned in to where they're at, then I might go into discover, ask, tell, ask in a different way and say, yeah, so is it okay if I share something I've observed in you? The person says yes. And then I say, I've noticed other times that you've been able to kind of work through situations like that time when you were in, math class and the teacher upsets you and yet you handle it. Tell me a little bit about what was going on then, and you surface the person's abilities in other areas to help them address the current issue or crisis or problem or whatever the situation might be. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. I hope if it doesn't make sense to you, George, please feel free to chime in and, ask a follow-up or clarification. All right, next question comes from Amy. It's for you as well, Sean. Can you speak more to working with persons with personality disorders who were not able to successfully resolve trauma via DBT? Do you have other trauma resolution techniques in complement to MI, especially for persons with borderline personality disorders?
Yeah, and so that is a lovely question. I'm glad you threw it to me, but I'm going to hand it off to Mary Ann in just a second.
Okay.
because that's really her domain of expertise is resolving trauma. Because the type of motivational interviewing, holding space, is really about getting people ready to do something. And so if I'm an employment specialist, which I was, and I noticed that trauma was getting in the way of someone, moving into the workforce or whatever goals we had identified together in partnership, then I'd say, I know of this type of intervention that works really well. Would you be interested in learning about it? And then I'd go through the discover, ask, tell, ask process, and that way, and also start to evoke in regards to the benefits of going to such treatment. And then I would hand them off to Marianne, as I'm going to do now.
Very nice, Sean. Thank you. Yeah, folks who have a lot of trauma in their background can have a development of a personality disorder, because that personality disorder is an adaptive tool that got them through life. One of the things that I find is, again, I'm an art therapist, so I might be just a titch biased on how well it works, but it really does work well on addressing issues of trauma in a really safe and non-judgmental way, and can help folks who are struggling in a variety of levels. Like currently I work with adults who are experiencing depression, anxiety, suicidality, and often who have co-occurring disorders like addiction, but also personality disorders as well. And we find that doing our therapy in the group setting, because the group sort of helps the accountability factor. And we employ a lot of motivational interviewing. I do, as well as the therapist that I work with, to help people step into stages of change. And the hardest part about working with someone who's really mired or married to their personality disorder, the things that have worked for them is that A, they're no longer working, but B, change is one of the hardest things we have to do. So it's kind of preparing them for change. But I find that art really helps, A, because we're kind of opening up all receptors in the brain and we're talking about it, and it can shift that perspective. So much like Sean just mentioned, where you might bring up something that you've seen positive that a person has done before, like, oh, I saw this behavior, but I saw this behavior, what might be the difference? That same type of thing comes up when people make art. And so it'll say, well, this time you made art about this, and last time it was like this, so can we talk about what's happened in between? Yeah, I hope that answered the question. Sean?
Yeah, and then one specific place that the person can go to is helpfortrauma.com. And the type of it's an art therapy based intervention, and it's been super successful, especially with folks for folks with that have personality disorders. So helpfortrauma.com.
Yeah. Thank you both. And this next one looks like both of you might want to chime in. Question comes from Keith. I have a consumer with a lot of childhood trauma and some adult trauma through unhealthy behavior / choices. He has a lot of anxiety and excess energy, high vigilance. Are there interventions you would recommend for him, both therapeutic and behavioral? I'm constantly suggesting physical exercise to offset his high energy level.
Yeah. I'm going to say the word mindfulness and then throw it to Marianne for just a second.
That's just the word I was thinking of too. A lot of times, well, all the time, trauma and traumatic loss disrupt our neural pathways and can make us feel frenzy and chaotic, and shows up in a lot of our behaviors, right? And this is what Sean and I talked about in the first webinar and kind of what we addressed a little bit here. And grounding techniques. So exercise is a great grounding technique, but so is meditation, which is a really broad term, but mindfulness meditation is very specific in how it's used. So focusing in on any of the 5 senses as you bring that awareness to your breath. So a lot of times I'll work with clients, I may give them a marble, right? And they just roll the marble in between their hands as I'm sort of counting out breath, like trying to even out the breath. And paying attention to that tactile stimulation in the hand, like what hand is moving the marble, what hand is receiving, and once you notice that, to switch that around. So it's a little bit almost like a distraction, but it's actually an intense focused meditation. And that can really help people to decompress, and then they can shift into focus. A lot of folks, I will say, struggle with meditation because when we have the traumatized brain, it's always looking for something. We're running amok. And even without the trauma, we have over 50,000 thoughts in our brain a day, as research has shown. So now when you add, trauma, stress, anxiety, all these things on top of it, it feels like that just comes rapid fire. So meditation is one of the ways that we can start to bring an awareness to those thoughts, and they become less overwhelming. We bring them in, we let them go, and then we can focus on something else.
Yeah. And to riff off of what Marianne was sharing is that, first of all, there's a really great book called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. And basically, he speaks to how everybody's entree into mindfulness is different. And, this, for example, me, I tried to be a mindfulness practitioner for 10 years. I was a miserable failure. And then I got trained in this particular type of meditation where they give you a secret word, and that did the trick for me. It's been super helpful to me. Now, the other thing is to know that there are types of physical movements, such as Marianne was just a very simple one. And doable one that Marianne was suggesting, but there's Tai Chi and yoga and martial arts, for kids. And I'm not sure where you're located, but in Milwaukee, there's an entity called Growing Minds, and they teach mindfulness to kids and teachers in schools. So they have an expertise in onboarding kids to that practice. So hopefully that got at the answer.
Yeah. Thank you both. This next one is just a comment somebody wanted to share with you, Marianne. So they're a professional listening to this, and they're also a caregiver, and they wanted to share that they're now adult daughters. You were their, oh my gosh, you were their daughter's art therapist. Yeah. Yes, she is now an adult. There we go. Back when she was a teen. And her painting that was named The Storm still hangs in their home, and she loved working with you, and it was her favorite part of treatment. So she just want to say thank you for everything that you do.
Well, and thank you for that. That means so much to me. Gotta dip out. It does. It means so much to me, and I'm always glad to hear that. So thank you for sharing, for sure. Yeah.
Next one is just a quick kind of housekeeping type question that I can answer. Someone was asking how to get a copy of this webinar to share with their colleagues. So just so everyone knows, we do archive all of our webinars, so you can access them at a later date. I know there are a few people who are having some internet connectivity issues, which I've also experienced. A lot of us are experiencing that right now. So if you do need to access any previous webinars, or you want to see part 1 of this series or revisit this one, please go to our website. That's projecte3.com. And there's a webcast tab, and it's under archive webcasts. So just want to share that quick with everyone. All right, next question. This one comes from Angelina. Is there a method for historical trauma? I work with Alaska Native American Indian consumers from different tribes. Many of them experience the primary diagnoses of depression, PTSD, anxiety, etc., followed by secondary responses of dependence on alcohol, drugs, etc. So any method for working with those folks?
It's interesting because my journey has really been about, like, how can we simplify all these things? Because organizations are so are asked, individuals within organizations are asked to serve so many different people, and that have so many different identities. And so my response to that is you adopt a concept called cultural humility, and also understand how it's integrated with trauma, which is a historical trauma piece, and in a big way, and also how the concept of holding space helps us be culturally reverent. So cultural humility is actually a thing, and it's a framework, and it's got 4 principles. The first is self-reflection and lifelong learning, and that is I need to be aware of my own identity and how I show up so that I know where I stop and the other person starts. And the other big piece of self-reflection, lifelong learning is to surface any implicit biases that I or another provider on my team might have. Become aware of those, because explicit biases, I get a choice. Implicit biases, I'm not making a choice. They're invisible to me. Second principle is third person is expert, which is very much what the concept of holding space is designed to do. Community as expert is when I'm serving a group of people, such as the person who asked the question, is I want to learn from them what they want and need from me. So my example for this is often at Project Excel, we'd ask the kids, why are you showing up? What are we doing that's right? And what can we do differently to make you want to show up more? Instead of assuming what they needed, we learned from them what they were wanting and needing from us. And then the fourth principle is institutional self-reflection and investment. And that is essentially, if I'm a program, an agency, a system, whatever, I need to ensure that there are multiple lenses that are looking at the policies and procedures that are being written, that are looking at the space, the physical space, to make sure it's welcoming and inviting to all a person's identity. And I'm using this word identity because one of the things that happens is, and this is Dr. Melanie Chervon is the person who manifested the concept of cultural humility in the four principles. And she writes this paper on it, and I'm glad to send a link to it so that folks can read it. And in there's a story, I'm just going to reference it. There's a story in there that identifies why cultural humility for me is a preferred framework than considering myself having the capacity to be competent in someone's culture. I'll just leave it at that.
Right. I'm going to add in, Sean, if I may.
Please.
When we're looking at historical trauma, it makes a lot of sense. Hurt people. And that hurt continues on through generations. And really to address that in multiple ways helps us to, when we have empathy, which is feeling what another person is feeling, we can start to develop compassion for them. And those things are rooted in a type of forgiveness. So there's a lot of things that we can do around historical traumas, looking at the timeline before your personal timeline. But it's always, like I said, most important to know that when someone is hurting and they're hurting other people, it's because, someone hurt that, like it's the trickle down factor. Hurt person hurt somebody, that person hurt somebody, that person hurt somebody. And the person who comes to us for help is the cycle stopper, right? This is the person who says, I can't do this. I can't continue to hurt other people anymore. I'm hurting terribly. How do we help me through this? So I always like to address those types of things when I work with people, that, you are here because you are trying to stop that cycle of hurt. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other piece that comes to mind that Marianne helped me remember is that, tuning into the person's culture and also the rituals that are identified with that culture. Because there's going to be a ritual that is about forgiveness, that is about healing, and that we can encourage them to embrace and adopt, and maybe bringing outside folks in to do with that, to work with that. One of the quotes that was in Marianne's piece is from our friend and colleague and my mentor, Jojapa Marie Saroma, who wrote a book called Wisdom Walk. I can't remember the rest of it, something self-mastery. And she is a trauma resolution specialist and also a shaman who carries the medicine from the medicine wheel of Burkina Faso, West Africa. And this can give you a hint in regards to how you might embrace the cultural rituals that the person has to help them go through a process of healing, and also connect with their ancestors, which is another thing that we could probably go on for some time about.
Thank you. So I'm just keeping an eye on the clock here, and I think we're going to have to leave it at that for the last question for today. I just want to reassure everyone, if you asked a question and we didn't get to it, we will follow up. So we'll send Sean and Marianne a list of the questions we didn't get to so that they can respond. Also want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have a really big group, and there's been lots of conversation in the chat and in the Q&A box, and we really, really appreciate people participating and taking part. And we hope that you'll join us for part 3, which comes up on, just double check, make sure I get this right, on June 18th at 11 a.m. Central Time. So again, that's June 18th at 11 a.m. Central Time. And then I also want to let people know, if you're interested in CRC or CEU credit for today's webcast, there's been a link. It's either just been added to the chat box or will be momentarily, that will give steps to request that credit. You can also find this information on our webcast page within our website at projecte3.com. Additionally, you'll receive an email tomorrow with these instructions. If you have any questions about CRC and this process, please feel free to direct those to projecte3tc@gmail.com. So I believe that's it for my housekeeping duties for today. Again, thank you everyone who was able to join us. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Marianne. It was really great to have you both here, both in your recorded format and live. So hopefully we see you all in June, and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.